afternoon, and welcome to the Living Well radio program. You can find us here every Wednesday at 1 p.m. on KATB 89.3 in Anchorage, KJLP 88.9 in Palmer, as well as you can catch us online at katb.org. My name is Cammie, and I'm here with my co-host Betty. How are you doing today, Betty?
I am very well. Thank you, Cammie. How are you?
Doing pretty well. We are just excited and delighted to have joining us today author Ruth McElwee. Ruth McElwee, thank you so much for being here today. And again, what I love so much about doing this program is just, again, reminding people right here in our own state the great resources that we have, and what a pleasure it is to have an author right here in our own community joining us today. And she's going to be sharing with us her story of God's redeeming love and just the trials that he's brought her through and the victory that she's now walking in. So I'm going to turn it over to Betty and get things started for us today.
Ruth, thank you for coming today. How was the drive up?
Oh, it was good.
I know you live in Soldotna. How were the roads?
They were just fine.
Well, good. I appreciate you coming. I know that you broke your foot, your ankle recently, and so now you're in a walking boot, and I hope it was not too painful for you to come up here.
It's an honor to be here, actually.
You and I just met a few minutes ago, face to face, but we've talked several times on the telephone and a lot through Instant Messenger on Facebook. And I want to tell everyone how we got acquainted, that you had just written a book and it had been published, and you asked if I would be willing, through Alaska Christian Women, to help you advertise. And I told you, I said, well, I need to know a little bit more about the book. And so you began to tell me the story of a little girl and what had happened to her in her life, and how it progressed on as she became a teenager. And it dawned on me that this might be about your life. And so when you told me that it was, I was instantly intrigued and knew that I wanted to have you on the show. So I have read your book, Broken Hearts Healed. And what I want to do today is just to give you time to tell your story. And so if you will, Ruth, if you'll take us back to when you were a child living at home, tell us what it was like. And you had brothers and sisters and your mom and dad. I believe your dad was a minister, or they were missionaries, and your mom was a school teacher. If you will just tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up.
Well, when I was a little girl, I grew up in a Christian home, and my dad was a pastor. My favorite place to be was church, and I absolutely loved the Lord. I was a 5-year-old, and I remember one time being in my parents' room listening to hymns, and one of the particular ones was Take My Life and Let It Be Consecrated. And I was just thinking about how much God loved me and how much I loved him. And I just felt in my heart that when I got older, he wanted me to become a missionary. And I didn't tell anybody that story. I just somehow knew that God had spoken to me. And I had good relationships with my family. I trusted people. I was a very loving little girl. And a situation happened where I was too young to go to kindergarten and for the kindergarten that we needed. And so I was put in a daycare, private daycare, and I was the oldest one there. So I was separated from all the other children, and I was put out on a porch, an enclosed porch, and we lived in Texas. And while I was there, I was asleep one day, and I woke up to a strange man standing beside me, and he didn't say anything. He just made me do something no child should ever have to do. And I remember being so afraid and so confused, but I didn't know what to do other than to do what he made me do. And his wife walked in, and her face just filled me. It was just so much hate and so much horror. And I just felt shame and guilt wash over me as this little 5-year-old girl, thinking it must be my fault. And neither one said a word. They just walked out of the room, and I never saw that man again. But I went home that day, and I must have told my mother what had happened, because I remember her words. And her words were, "Ruth Mary, I cannot believe that." Well, to a 5-year-old, all I could think was, she must think I'm lying, and I didn't know anything else to do, so I just shut down emotionally, and I didn't talk to her about it anymore. And my dad, a few days later, I had always been very affectionate, and for whatever reason, he chose to no longer show affection to me. And so in my mind as a 5-year-old, I thought, I must be the one at fault. I must have done something wrong. Nobody hugged me. Nobody talked to me. Nobody said, I'm sorry. Nobody explained anything to me. And I was left with all these emotions of what in the world do I do with all this? Back in the 1960s, nobody talked about child sexual abuse. And we didn't talk it about at my house either. I was returned to the same daycare a few days later, but I was kept with all the other children. And I remember at nap time pulling my barrettes out of my hair, smashing them together as if they were male and female. And I was just letting the tears fall silently. It wasn't sexual. I just wanted somebody to hurt this man who'd hurt me. Later on, when I went to school, we lived 9 miles from the border of Mexico, and I have a Middle Eastern background. And in Texas, I had a perpetual tan. And I remember the kids asked me, what are you? Because I wasn't Mexican and I wasn't white. And I didn't understand that either as a little girl. But I began to realize that I was different, and they made fun of me. And this whole time, I'm still dealing with all these silent emotions of being abused but not understanding. And a few years later, I remember Dad called me into his room. And what happened was with my parents, because I didn't understand why Dad stopped hugging me, I thought Mom thought I lied. I actually believed that neither one of them loved me anymore. So to look at me on the outside, you may not have seen that person that was struggling on the inside, feeling all those feelings. And I remember Dad told me the man that had molested me was dead. I remember thinking I was glad, because I was glad he was in hell. And I thought, oh my gosh, I can't think that, because you're not supposed to feel that way. But from that moment, for the next several years of my life, I did not consciously remember what he had done to me. And so I had no memory of it. My whole mental state was just repressing that. Then we moved to West Virginia, and I thought, oh, this will be different, and people will like me. At least I hope that way. And my very first day at school, I was talking to a boy, and I said, you speak very nicely. And somebody said to me, what, have you never seen a black person before? And I don't know whether I had or hadn't, but color didn't bother me. And the very first day of school, my classmates said, what are you? Because again, I wasn't white and I wasn't black. And so once again, having all that pain that I'd already carried, now I felt rejected. Later on, boys would tease me about my name being Ruth, and they would literally bark at me every day at the bus stop. People would tell me that I was ugly, and it just made, and they would bark at me every day. So I felt like I was like not even human, more like a dog. And I began to believe all that. And in the midst of all of that, even though I had loved God and I knew that he loved me, somehow that whole relationship changed, and I saw him as a God of rules and regulations and punishment, and I really thought he was angry at me. So it's a really sad, painful story as it continues. And so in 7th grade, I was desperate for attention, and a boy said he loved me. Or no, he didn't say he loved me. I fell in love with him. He said he liked me. And he was cute. He was popular. He was like, an athlete. And I was hesitant but hungry to feel loved. And I gave him my heart and my money and my body and everything I could think of except my virginity. And he used me, and he made fun of me, and he ruined my reputation. And he was still dating somebody else openly, so I told myself he must really like me because he's seeing me on the side. And I didn't like what was happening, but I just didn't know how to feel liked and loved. When I thought that relationship would turn into something special, it didn't. And a few years later, I ended up in a situation where another guy was calling me a tease. And I was so tired of being called a tease. that I remember saying yes. And I remember in my heart, everything inside of me was screaming out, no, 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 I don't want this. But I just made myself stay silent. And after it was over, he looked at me with this taunting grin and said, you just lost your virginity. And I remember turning away from him with tears trickling down my cheeks. And I thought to myself, who cares? And something inside me died that day. I was 16 years old, and I remember thinking, I will never be a missionary. I will never be married. No man will ever have me now. I'm a preacher's kid, for heaven's sakes. And it's not like I didn't know any better. There was never drugs or alcohol involved in any of this story. So just the level of suicidal thoughts was plaguing to me because I was still going to church every Sunday and still struggling through all those feelings and emotions. And a few weeks later, or maybe a few months later into this relationship, I remembered thinking and being afraid I was pregnant. And I thought, what am I going to do? And I ended up telling my parents because I decided I would either tell my parents or I'd try to commit suicide. And I remember telling Dad, you've got to be objective. I know you're a pastor and you're not going to be able to handle this. And he said, I can handle whatever you can tell me. And I told them. And it absolutely broke my dad's heart. It just devastated them. But out of that deep pain was a turning point in my life, because out of that, my dad took me to a Christian counselor. And within the first 2 or 3 sessions of meeting with this Christian counselor, I remembered what had happened to me when I was 5 years old. And even though I looked back on it and saw all those memories and all those feelings, I could see what I had become, a promiscuous, bitter, sarcastic, rebellious girl. But this summer I was 16, I went away. And God got a hold of my heart, and I fell in love with Jesus, and it was amazing. I found out how much he loved me, how much he could redeem me, how much he cared about me. And I thought, oh, this is it. I have forever changed. And I came back to my community of 2,000 people, and the temptations were still there, and I fell. So it was several years before those lifestyle patterns changed. But finally, when I was in college, I was 21 years old, and I went out on the track field, bent down on my knees, and I said, Jesus, I can never be a virgin again. I can never be pure again. But if you can do anything with what's left of my life, I give it all to you. And I meant it. And that was at 21 years old. And Jesus changed me from the inside out, cleansed me, healed me, restored me, called me into missions, called me into Youth with a Mission, which is where I met my husband, Ross. We've been married 25 years. And when we met, he was 18 years old, and I was 25. God has a tremendous sense of humor, because I remember thinking, as I would get to know him, I'd stop him in the middle of a conversation. I'd say, how old did you say you were? And he said, 18. I said, okay. And I went right back to the conversation, and I thought, no way, this can't be God. This has got to be the flesh. This has got to be the devil. This has got to be the distraction. This cannot be the Lord, because there's just too much of an age difference. But I'd never met anybody quite like him in my life, who loved God, who got saved at 4 years old, who walked with Jesus, who wasn't perfect, but really wanted to walk with the Lord. And on top of that was a virgin. And the Lord just did phenomenal things in our relationship to bring us to the place where we fell in love.
Can I ask you to talk a little bit more about being in high school, what your relationship was like with your parents? And I know in your book you mentioned a teacher that saw the potential in you for the first time. I think you were a senior in high school, and this teacher saw your giftedness for writing. Would you talk to us just a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the places in my deep places of pain was to always write poetry. And at the time, I probably had over 180 poems. And I would sometimes let my peers read them, and they would say, these are really good. And I just didn't really believe that. But I wanted to be a writer. And one day a poet came to our school, and my very special teacher, Mrs. J, was like, you need to show her this poetry. And I was shy, but I remember I showed her, and she kept looking through my notebook and reading these pieces of these poems that I'd written. And finally, this woman looked at me and said, you've got the gift. And I didn't even know what she was talking about. I didn't know what gift she meant. But that was something that began this process where something came alive in me again, and thought maybe someday there could be something to this writing that isn't just about me or doesn't just touch my life. Maybe I could actually influence people. And so when I was 21 in college, the Lord spoke to me and said, you need to get rid of your poetry. And I remember telling him, you can't be serious, God. That's my identity. And he said, I know. I want to be your identity. And then he showed me that a lot of those poems were spiritual ties to an old life that I wasn't a part of anymore. And there were things that I just needed to get rid of that really weren't honoring to Jesus. And I tore those poems up bit by bit in my dorm room. And I remember just crying and being filled with joy at the same time, and saying to the Lord, all my dreams of ever being a writer, I just lay them completely on the altar of commitment and surrender, and I don't know if you'll ever give it back. And so phenomenally, when I was, Ross and I had been married 20 years, and on my 20th wedding anniversary, the Holy Spirit said, now's the time for you to write this book.
Wow. During this time when you were in high school and in college, the relationship with your parents, did that improve?
It was really volatile and very harsh for a long time. It began to improve when I went to counseling at 16, and then it got better and better as I opened up to them, and we were able to work through some things. And then when I went off to college, my 21st birthday, I asked them for something very special, and I said, I just want a letter from both of you. And in that letter, both of them affirmed who I was as a woman of God, as their daughter, as somebody beautiful on the inside and out. And so the Lord just did amazing things in restoring the relationships that had been broken and wounded.
Now, after you graduated college, you've always felt called to missions, and you joined YWAM.
Yes.
Can you tell our audience what is YWAM?
Youth with a Mission is an international, interdenominational missionary organization all over the world. My husband and I were in it for 7 years, both in Tyler, Texas, and then briefly in Barbados, West Indies. It's a missionary training school, discipleship training school. And so I was there, and during that time, we were both there for training. Then he came a year after I was there, and then we got engaged and went through School of the Bible together as an engaged couple, planned our wedding, and got married. And then he was on staff for 3 years teaching at a Bible school, and I was on staff teaching at the private Christian school.
How did you end up in Alaska?
That in itself is another whole story, but we were living in Texas we'd been living there for 12 years, raising our kids after we came back from Barbados, West Indies, which is 21 years ago. And we ended up going with our church to Alaska to help out at a camp, getting it ready for the summer. And it was during that time that the Lord spoke to me, spoke to my husband separately, and said, I want you back on the mission field, and I want you to move to Alaska. So I won't tell you all the ins and outs of that, but the amazing story is that God used Google. That's our joke. And we found the church where we served, which was in White Mountain, Alaska, a village of 200 people, and we lived there for 7 years. And my husband was the pastor of the only church in that community.
Wow. Can you, and looking back over your life, how it was when you were a child and where you're at now, can you identify with the verse that says beauty from the ashes?
Absolutely, absolutely. The places that have been the most painful and the most difficult, I can see through this book and through my life how God has taken those very ugly places and used them for his glory. And it reminds me so much of, it dawned on me just a few months ago of how I was always wanted the Lord to take my life and let it be consecrated. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, you just did that, Lord. You just took all these ugly pieces and parts, not just the good parts, but you were taking my life and letting it be written in a story, in a format that people can read about it and be encouraged and inspired and say, you know, Jesus healed her. He can heal me.
Mm-hmm. Have you, I'm sure you've talked with many women, maybe young girls that have been in your situation. I am sure you've been a blessing and a help and encouragement to them. But when you prepared to write the book, or when you finished it up, somewhere along the line you had to tell your children. And do you mind sharing that with us?
My kids knew my story. Interesting enough, my oldest daughter wanted to have me write my story of how God put Mommy and Daddy together. Mm-hmm. She was probably 13 or 14 at the time. And I wrote just a brief, short, rough draft of that. And it was my daughter who looked at me knowing my full story. And she said, Mom, this is a sweet story, but it won't have the kind of impact that it needs to have unless you tell the rest of it. And I remember looking at her and saying, the rest of all of it, like before I met your dad? And she said, yes, Mom, my peers need to read it.
Mm-hmm. Just I'm gonna ask. So, are your parents still alive?
No, my father passed away in 2007 before I ever wrote this book. My mother passed away, but my mother was alive when I wrote this book. In fact, when the Lord spoke to me and told me to write this book, I called my mother in Florida and I said, Mom, I believe that God wants me to write this book and tell my story, but I won't do it unless I have your blessing and unless you want me to, because this book could hurt you more than anybody else, and I love you and I don't want to hurt you. And I waited on the phone, and my mother's words were, oh, Ruth Mary, you have to write this book. It's a calling from the Lord. There is no one who knew you in high school who could not say, look what an amazing thing the Lord has done.
I think probably one of my favorite parts of your book is the restoration of your relationship with your mom and dad. It's almost like your mom just couldn't get enough of you. I felt like maybe felt like she'd been separated from you for so long. But then all she wanted to do was just to talk to you and to listen to you and to hug on you. I mean, after she met Ross,
yes,
I mean, it was just, she wanted all of you.
Absolutely.
She wanted it all over again to restore the relationship with you. And
it was super amazingly sweet, the relationship I had with Mom and Dad once Ross came into my life. Beautiful, beautiful relationship restored. And when God restores, he doesn't just restore a husband and a wife. He wants to restore those family relationships. It's rich and sweet. As it relates to my mom, Dad passed away before we moved to Alaska, but my mother was able to call me all the time in Alaska, and she and I became best friends. And she was able to remember things from being a pastor's wife that she hadn't shared with anybody because she'd had no need to. Mm-hmm. And so she became my confidant, my friend, my encouragement. And it's just phenomenal what the Lord has done. And I miss her, but I know that she read this book and she wanted it published. She wanted it out there.
What I know the book just recently became available. The title of the book is Broken Hearts Healed. How can people, where's it available at?
It is available on Amazon. It should be available by request at your local Christian bookstore. You can also get it and connect with me on my website, which is www.brokenheartshealed.org, and or my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/heartshealed. You can also connect with me directly if you want to at ruthmcelwee@gmail.com.
And let's spell the last name.
That's McElwee.
Okay, I want to ask you, since the book has come out, I know you've been accepting some speaking engagements. What has been the reaction?
I have had people that have been very encouraging, people that have been really touched, both men, women, teenagers. The response has been really encouraging to me, and it's my hope and desire that the Lord would open up many more doors for ministry purposes.
Let's suppose someone is listening that may have been in the situation or may be in the situation now where they are being abused, and they just wanted to talk to you. Could they contact you through your Facebook page, or is there another way they could contact you? Do you have an email that you'd want to share?
Just the email that I just gave would be fine. If you wanted to contact me, you could private message me just so that we can keep it that way. I'd also encourage you to know that it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And that God weeps with you. And I'd encourage you to find someone that you can trust, whether that's your pastor, a counselor, a good friend, for you not to be alone and isolated and feeling like there's no hope, because God is a God of all hope, and it's not his desire that anyone should be abused.
Ruth, I just want to thank you so much for coming and sharing your story. I know it wasn't easy, but I do appreciate it, and it just amazes me how God brought us together, and he's such a great God, and thank you, and I just, I can't wait to see what God's going to do with all of this.
Thank you so much for letting me be here.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Appreciate your time. Again, this is the Living Well radio program, and you can find us here every Wednesday at 1 p.m. on KATB 89.3 in Anchorage, KJLP 88.9 in Palmer, as well as you can catch us online at katb.org.